This update for October 24, 2023, day 608 of the war and of the date update. Also update catch up for October 23 and October 22. There's really, well, let's say not much going on in Ukraine. In the world, that's definitely a different story. So I'm going to start with a general strategic update, and then I'm going to switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. In terms of strategic situation, as everybody is seeing on the news, it's we on the edge probably of potential World War III, which may start between initially Iran and Israel and so on, and then there is a high chance that it will cascade into involvement of China and Russia. China already sent six military ships to the area, and they clearly stating that they want open Gaza. So they already very clearly voicing their position. Situation in Chinese economy is deteriorating quite significantly, to the point that the Chinese president had to go to the central bank as if it's gonna sort of fix the problem, because he actually created that problem with his actions, where he's essentially scaring investors. And in some way, I actually want to say that there's a very good parallel with the Soviet Union right after Civil War, end of the Civil War, which was like in 1921, essentially, even 1922. And there was a new economic policy where there's a lot of freedom. There were a lot of problems as well that came with it, and it's not sort of just positive. There are tons of problems, but net result was extremely positive, and it was actually based on the basis was actually surprisingly for communism sound money, which was gold-backed system, and actually allowed to quickly rebuild the economy after World War I and Civil War. And then after sort of economy kind of grew, become better, stronger, and so on, then Stalin kind of fully came into power. And started destroying all of those sort of relatively limited by the economic freedoms that allowed actually to create a renaissance in the economy, and started steering country into the direction of the war. So in some ways, China went through the same sort of circle, starting from, let's say, 92, 93. There was a lot of liberalization, a lot of foreign investments, foreign money. There was a lot of export, good and trade, and everything. So China flourished. There were a lot of problems. It's not like everything's perfect. There's no question about it. But net result for China was definitely positive, and for the world. And then you see the person sort of strong-willed coming and with desire to kind of like tighten the screws on the economy and basically can fully control and micromanage economy, and that really leads to destruction of the economy, and that really forces then more tyrannical actions, including the war. That's exactly that the Soviet Union was going through in the 30s, where it was buying actually all sort of like military equipment to build basically, sorry, not military equipment, but equipment to build military equipment actually from the West. And that's why I'm saying it's exactly the same parallels, because essentially West built what China is right now, and now it's going to be facing what it sort of created. So sorry for this kind of like sidetracking, but it's just very interesting parallels that they exactly as it says. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and it does rhyme quite a bit here in this case. So I just want to share that. So again, there is Chinese ships there. Then There's even Australian troops or some ships and everything coming to the area. So it's very clear that there is extremely high tension in this region, and it's literally flip of a coin. We're on the edge of potentially escalating into really big war. So hopefully that doesn't happen. Now I'm gonna switch a little bit. Oh, and then in terms of Israel and dealing with Hamas, it's, as I mentioned before when it all started, it's just basically going to be fighting in Stalingrad, and that's just going to be, I would say, terrible experience for Israeli troops, and obviously terrible experience for the civilians in Gaza. So it may end up similar to the situation with the German army in Stalingrad eventually. So I think I'd say part of the reason why Israel is not terribly sort of rushing ahead with the situation, because there are sort of, how to say, sober heads that realizing that this is going to be extremely costly for Israel. And the cost is not going to be just 1,000 soldiers. It's going to be very high. That may shock Israel population. Now let's switch to the situation closer to Ukraine, and I just want to show how state finances are working in Russia, and they probably, to be fair, every country that does the war. Something similar is happening in Ukraine, except Ukraine doesn't have any real economy at this point. So what Russian sort of government does, they actually pool money from local local regional budgets. So, for example, in 2024, they reduced transfers from the federal budget to the local ones by 16%. So what happens is, it is obviously very clear, is Russian government needs money for the war, so they pulling money from any place they can, obviously, reducing transfers to the local budgets. But at the same time, Russia is actively supporting its ally Belarus, which is north of Ukraine, and Russia will send about like 640 million US dollars to Belarus to compensate for the losses in oil refining industry in Belarus. So that's just one example of how Russia is supporting Belarus, and there are probably more transfers. This is just probably what's known. The Belarus is fairly small country, it's less than 10 million people, and this is not obviously huge money, but there are probably more sort of transfers to Belarus to support the political regime there, and ensure that you have your sort of neighbor closely aligned to you. And basically this is kind of like a Russia's bridgehead into Europe, essentially. So as you can see, the sort of internal Russian regions, they were squeezed out of money, and then money is being directed towards war and then supporting, let's say, formally it's international ally of Russia. Now let's actually switch to the situation on the front line in Ukraine. I'm gonna start from the very north, and then I'm gonna do it in a clockwise fashion. So the situation along the state border remains more or less the same. No essential changes there. Now let's move to North Lugansk front line. Things here are also pretty much the same. Some Russian attacks, but they're all tactical in the same areas, as you can see, with the same results of not moving anywhere. But Russian command is actually trying, I would say, to seize the initiative. It's not fully in their hands yet, but it's sort of tilting in that direction. Now let's move to the North Donbass front line. Things here in the northern sector remain the same. It's quiet. There's not much going on here. Then there are some weak Russian attacks in the areas where Russian troops lost ground in the past. They're just trying to basically recapture, but those attacks, again, purely tactical, small scale, nothing major yet. Now let's move to the central Donbass front line. So the main sort of focus of actually entire war right now shifted in some ways to Avdiyivka, because that's becoming sort of major Russian operation on the front line, where, as mentioned before, they're trying to encircle Avdiyivka and create a threat of encirclement and squeeze Ukrainian troops out of it in that way. So far, let me look at the situation. Situation remains stable. Russian side suffering heavy losses, Ukrainian side suffering losses, smaller but still heavy losses as well. Mostly in people, less so in equipment, but Russian side is also suffering heavily equipment-wise. This key ash pile or ash hill, because it's really kind of like ash, it basically remains sort of unoccupied by either side. It's simply impossible to hold on there. You've probably seen this propaganda pictures with Russian flags. So this is sort of reminds me actually another story from World War II. This time when German troops went on the Caucasus, I think it was Elbrus, and they put their flag there to sort of show like sort of victory, but in the end they had to leave from there. So it's kind of like the same idea. The Russian troops put the flag there, but essentially there's no people, just a flag, and essentially neither side is capable of holding it, because it's just basically a pile of ash and you cannot really dig in it effectively. You cannot really have any kind of like reasonable protection in that pile of ash. So so this is but there's quite a bit of fighting around it. Beyond that situation, there's not much changes here. Now let's look at Zaporizhya front line. Things here are also more or less similar. Russian troops trying to have this purely tactical, relatively small scale attacks here around south of Velika Novosilka, where they lost ground. So they're basically trying to recapture ground, and similar things are happening near Robotine or Rikhiv. So the same Russian attacks just to recapture ground without any success. Now let's move to the situation along the Dnipro River. So things remain the same. Ukrainian forces trying to maintain bridgeheads and expand them in terms of the number of them, not expanding them in depth and width. That actually not really happening. Actually, Russian troops actively was counterattacking and trying to destroy the bridgeheads. They managed to somewhat gain some ground, squeeze somewhat Ukrainian troops, but they still managed, Ukrainian troops still managed to hold on to the bridgeheads. So basically the opportunity remains there, essentially. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.